And now we'll hear from, as an individual, Jeffrey Simser, please.
Thank you. I'm an expert in money laundering, and I am here to offer you 5 ideas that the government could consider. The first is, and I was Canada's first Director of Civil Asset Forfeiture. The first is this: the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, Terrorist Financing Act was recently amended to add a structuring provision. All good. I'm suggesting it be repealed. I'm suggesting that instead you port it and move it into the criminal code. And here's why. Canada has been criticized in the past by the Financial Action Task Force for not using our existing money laundering offenses in prosecutions. For example, we use Section 354, which is possession of proceeds of crime, instead of the money laundering prosecution. And the reason for this is pretty simple. The penal consequences are the same, and it's much more difficult to take a judge through the money laundering provisions. And even though there have been changes to the mens rea of that, it's still a problematic provision to use because the prosecutor has to find a predicate offense. And of course, organized crime obviously organizes their affairs to separate their crime from their money as a risk mitigation strategy, and it makes it much less likely to prosecute on money laundering. So my recommendation is to bring the structuring offense out of the PCML-TFA and make it a designated offense under the code so that a prosecution for money laundering would be a prosecution for money laundering, not for the predicate crime. I'll give you a second idea that's similar. So Project Collector out of Alberta interdicted a long-standing money laundering operation. They were moving $200,000 per suitcase across between Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, and Calgary. They might have moved upwards of $1 billion in cash, but the problem is airport screening could not stop them. There was no problem moving $200,000 in a suitcase. Try to put a bottle of hand lotion in your suitcase, you'll have a problem, not $200,000. So my idea here is that we add to the code a provision for bulk cash smuggling. There is a provision in the U.S. code that's similar. That would be an offense. And again, you could prosecute a money launderer for money laundering. Finally, I have 3 points about civil asset forfeiture. The first is around FinTRAC. So in the spring, the government announced in the budget that they would finally allow FinTRAC to share information with civil forfeiture authorities. We've been hoping for this for almost 25 years. That's a really good thing. It's not in place yet. But there is a risk to be managed because in a civil forfeiture case, the director of civil forfeiture is allowed, using the civil process, to compel information from the bad guy, from the respondent. And they're deemed to undertake to that defendant or respondent not to use that information for any other purpose. And the problem is that FinTRAC routinely collects something called a VIR, Voluntary Information Report, from police, and then they put that into their database. And so there is a big risk that if they put civil forfeiture information into a database and then it's used to lay charges and to prosecute someone, that there'll be a defense motion 5 or 6 years later that will have the case thrown out because there's a derivative use problem. So what I suggest here is that the Standing Committee amend the PCML-TFA to provide clarity on how their process works and to ask them to work with the 9 civil forfeiture jurisdictions to ensure that the information can be transferred without that problem occurring. My fourth brief thought is around the RCMP. So the RCMP has an operational manual that guides their members about how to conduct investigations and how to address civil forfeiture. And what the manual says right now is civil forfeiture is always a last resort, and that's wrong. That might have been right 25 years ago. It's wrong now. And I think that they should change the protocols within their operational manual to make civil forfeiture part of the planning early on cases. And this isn't about the primacy of a criminal prosecution. No one argues that should be first. But what's happening right now is files are being held back because it's last resort. And by the time it gets to civil forfeiture, nothing can be done. And the bad guys are laughing all the way to the bank because they get their tainted assets returned. And my final thought is about a gap in the Bank Act, which I know sounds unusual, but under the Bank Act, Section 461 of the Bank Act says that a bank deposit account is deemed to exist at the branch where it was started. We have a couple of jurisdictions, PEI and Newfoundland, for example, that don't have civil forfeiture. So what we're seeing is someone could set up an account in Charlottetown, do all of their dirty business in Vancouver, and then when the Civil Forfeiture Authority in BC comes forward, they can say you don't have jurisdiction because it's a PEI bank account and there's no civil forfeiture there. So that's something that I think would be a simple legislative fix to 461, allow a court to say where the bank account is for the purposes of a civil forfeiture proceeding, that is where it's transacted, and then you'll close that loophole. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr.